she seemed happy. That is what Patrick Clancy told the jury on Monday, July 27, 2026. The man who lost 3 children on the night of January 24, 2023, who came home to find them dying in the basement and his wife broken on the ground below the second-story window, sat in the witness stand at Plymouth Superior Court and told 18 jurors that on the day Lindsay strangled Cora, Dawson, and Callan, she had seemed happy. She had seemed, he said, like she was having one of her best days. One of her best days. That sentence is the most devastating thing said in an American courtroom this year. Not because it proves anything about whether Lindsay Clancy was psychotic or calculating or sick or cruel, but because of what it means that her husband, who knew her better than anyone, who had watched her deteriorate for months, who had accompanied her to psychiatric hospitalizations and back, could not tell. He could not tell, on one of her best days, that she was about to kill their children. Either the illness hid itself that well, or the plan hid itself that well. That is the specific question that will define this trial, and it will take months to answer. This is Forensic Disconnect, and today we are covering everything: the full opening statements from both the prosecution and the defense, every key piece of Patrick Clancy's testimony from day one, the new details that emerged this week that were not public before, the specific legal theory each side is building, and the impossible question at the center of this case: was Lindsay Clancy a calculating killer or a woman so destroyed by illness and medication that she did not understand what she was doing? Before we go further, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Here at Forensic Disconnect, we unlock the cases that deserve to be remembered. New investigations every week. Subscribe. Let's start from the beginning. Not from January 24th, 2023. From the beginning. Lindsay Clancy was born and raised in Connecticut. She trained as a nurse and eventually joined the labor and delivery unit at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, one of the most respected medical institutions in the world. She chose the specialty that is about birth, about the beginning of life, about being present in the rooms where families start. Her colleagues knew her as competent and caring. Her patients trusted her in the most vulnerable hours of their lives. She and Patrick Clancy met in 2013. They started dating. They moved in together in September 2015. They married. They settled in Duxbury, Massachusetts, an upscale coastal town about 30 miles south of Boston, the kind of place people specifically choose to raise children. They had Cora in 2017, Dawson in 2019, Callan in May 2022. After Callan was born, the world that Lindsay and Patrick had built together began to fracture in a way that, for months, neither of them fully understood. Patrick described it on the stand Monday. In September 2022, they went to a wedding in New Hampshire. During a walk, Lindsay told him she thought she was going to start taking Zoloft. She said, "I think it's going to help with my anxiety and going back to work." She told him she was going to see a psychiatrist. What Patrick did not know, and what he testified he learned later, was that Lindsay already had the prescription when she told him about it. She had not told him immediately. She had made the decision, obtained the medication, and disclosed it in stages. That specific detail, she had the prescription before she told him, is the first piece of evidence the prosecution will use to build a portrait of a woman who managed information about her own mental state carefully, who made decisions about her psychiatric treatment without fully involving the person who slept beside her every night and who would ultimately come home to find what he found. She took Zoloft for a period, Patrick testified, but she told him her sleep suffered, so she stopped taking it. Between September 2022 and January 2023, the 4 months before the killings, Lindsay was prescribed medications by at least 3 different providers. Reddington told the jury in his opening statement that the total number of different medications prescribed to her was 13. 13 different psychiatric drugs in 4 months from 3 different providers. Antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications, sleep aids, mood stabilizers, possibly antipsychotics. The full medication history has not yet been presented to the jury, but the number, 13, is now part of the trial's public record. And here is the detail that emerged through the prosecution's questioning of Patrick on Monday. It appears his ex-wife had taken only a fraction of the many pills she had been prescribed. A fraction. Patrick testified he was not aware of how much medication Lindsay had or had not taken. He did not know. The woman who had been prescribed 13 different medications over 4 months had been taking only a fraction of them, and the person she slept beside every night had no idea. Why had she not been taking them? That question does not yet have a public answer. The defense will presumably argue that the medications were not working, that she had stopped taking them because they made things worse, or that the specific drugs that were prescribed were the problem rather than the solution. The prosecution may argue something darker, that the medications were not taken because she was managing her presentation, that she was not as sick as the prescription history suggests, because she was not actually consuming what was prescribed. A fraction. That detail will live in this trial for months. Now let's go to what Patrick described happening as winter approached. He told the jury that Lindsay told him, at some point in the months before January, that she was having thoughts of suicide and thoughts of harming their kids. She told him. She disclosed the intrusive thoughts to her husband. He testified that at one point he asked her directly, "Do you feel like you need to be kept away from them?" She said no. Do you feel like you need to be kept away from them? The question that a husband asks when his wife has told him she is having thoughts of harming their children. And she said no. She was not a danger to them. She did not need to be separated. She was fine. And Patrick believed her. Because she was his wife. Because the fibers of her soul are loving. Those are words he wrote days after the children died, and they were the words of a man who, even in the wreckage, believed in who she was. He asked her the question. She said no. He believed no. Lindsay was hospitalized in late December 2022. She was admitted because she was still having thoughts of suicide. She spent several days there. She was discharged. Then she was hospitalized again in early January 2023. Same reason, still having thoughts of suicide, more days in a psychiatric facility, then discharged again. After the second discharge, Patrick testified, she seemed much better. She said she was no longer having suicidal thoughts. She seemed to be improving. And on January 24, 2023, she asked him to go to CVS in Kingston and then pick up dinner in Plymouth. He went. He stopped at CVS first, then drove to Plymouth. And while he was driving, his phone rang. It was Lindsay. He took the call. She seemed fine. She seemed fine. He came home. He found the children in the basement. Now let's go to the opening statements, because the specific language each side used to frame this case is the language the jury will carry with them for months. Plymouth County Assistant District Attorney Shannon Buckingham spoke first. She began by naming the children. Not by describing the crime. By naming them. Cora, Dawson, Callan. We are here, ladies and gentlemen, because they are not. Buckingham told the jury that Lindsay Clancy deliberately and meticulously planned their deaths, that she was a woman who no longer liked the life she thought she wanted, that it was getting harder and harder to control, that when she saw the opportunity to escape, she made the selfish choice to kill. This was not a woman in the throes of psychosis on January 24, 2023. These are Buckingham's words, spoken directly to the jury. This was a woman who acted intentionally, rationally, and swiftly to accomplish a very specific goal: to kill. Buckingham also said Lindsay had been calculating and manipulative, that she had concealed key information from her husband and her medical providers, that the portrait of a woman destroyed by illness is not what the evidence will show. The evidence will show a woman who managed what her husband knew about her medications, who managed what her doctors knew about her actual state, and who, on January 24th, managed the timing of the crime itself by researching the driving time of the route she sent Patrick on. The prosecution's theory requires the jury to believe something specific and disturbing, that Lindsay Clancy was not the woman the illness destroyed. She was the woman who chose, who looked at her children and saw obstacles to escaping a life she no longer wanted, who planned how to remove them, who sent her husband on a specific errand along a specific route whose driving time she had already calculated, who acted rationally and intentionally and then took her husband's phone call after the children were dead and before he arrived home. Then Kevin Reddington stood up. Reddington told the jury, "You people are going to have to listen to some of the most horrific things, look at some of the most horrific things." He told them 13 medications. He named that number in the first minutes of his opening statement. 13 different psychiatric medications prescribed to Lindsay between September 2022 and January 2023. 13. 3 different providers. A woman who was telling the medical system that something was wrong, who was prescribed medication after medication after medication because nothing was working, and whose brain, in the specific neurological chaos of postpartum psychosis combined with 13 concurrent or sequential medications, produced what it produced on January 24th. He told them a voice in her head ordered her to kill the children and herself. That is what Lindsay stated in her civil lawsuit against her medical providers, a lawsuit she and Patrick both filed earlier this year, accusing those providers of failing to properly diagnose, treat, and monitor a severe postpartum psychiatric condition. A voice. A command hallucination. A specific psychiatric symptom in which an auditory hallucination does not merely accompany psychosis, but directs behavior. Orders it. He told them she was hospitalized. Twice. In December and again in January. That she went to the people whose job it was to help her and told them what was happening, that they discharged her, that 3 weeks after her second discharge, she sent Patrick to CVS. He told them he would embrace and adopt and welcome every witness who described Lindsay Clancy as a wonderful person, an incredible mother, a lovely human being. Because in his theory of the case, that is what she was, and the woman who killed Cora and Dawson and Callan was not that woman. She was what the illness and the medications made. She was the wreckage of a person the system failed to save. Those are the 2 theories. They are not reconcilable. They cannot both be true. The jury will spend months inside both of them, weighing the evidence, listening to experts, watching Patrick Clancy on the stand, and eventually deciding which one the law must act on. Now let's go deeper into Patrick's testimony, because what he described on Monday is the most specific, most human account yet available of what happened in the Clancy household in the months before January 24th. He described each of the 3 children on the stand. He appeared to get emotional. He took deep breaths. Cora, the oldest, 5 years old. Dawson, 3. Callan, 8 months, the baby whose birth in May 2022 began the sequence of events that ended in the basement on January 24th. He described watching Lindsay struggle after Callan was born, the depression that developed, the anxiety, the sleep that was never right. He described the Zoloft conversation at the New Hampshire wedding in September 2022. He described learning she already had the prescription. He described the 3 different providers who prescribed her medications across those 4 months. He described asking her whether she felt like she needed to be kept away from the children. She said no. He described the hospitalizations. She was admitted in late December because she was still having thoughts of suicide. She went in again in early January for the same reason. After the second discharge, she seemed much better. She said she was no longer having suicidal thoughts. And then he described January 24th, the day she seemed happy, the day she seemed like she was having one of her best days. He went to CVS. He picked up dinner. He called her on the way home, and she seemed fine. He came home and found what he found. His testimony is expected to continue on Wednesday. He is expected to detail his return to the house, what he saw when he arrived, what he did, the 911 call he made, a call whose contents Judge Sullivan has ruled will not be made public at Patrick's request, a motion the judge granted Friday. The jury will hear the call. The public will not. Whatever Patrick said to the dispatcher in those moments is protected from public release by the judge's order. Now let's talk about the specific detail that the prosecution surfaced through their questioning of Patrick, the detail about the fraction of medications she had taken. Because this is potentially one of the most significant pieces of evidence in the entire trial, and it has not received the attention it deserves in the coverage so far. Lindsay was prescribed 13 medications. 13. From 3 different providers, and she had taken only a fraction of them. There are several possible explanations for this. The defense's most likely explanation is that the medications were not tolerated, that Lindsay experienced side effects, that they worsened her symptoms, that she stopped taking them because they were not helping or because they were actively making things worse. This is consistent with Reddington's argument about polypharmacy and its dangers. If Lindsay was prescribed drugs that made her feel worse and she stopped taking them, she was making a rational decision about her own treatment, even in the context of severe illness. The prosecution's explanation is darker. If Lindsay was not taking the medications she was prescribed, she may have been managing her presentation to her providers, appearing sicker than she was when she needed to secure prescriptions, appearing better than she was when she needed to be discharged from hospitalization. If she was selectively consuming medications in ways that allowed her to control how she appeared to the people around her, that behavior is consistent with the prosecution's portrait of a calculating, manipulative woman who managed information carefully. The jury does not yet know which explanation is correct. The medical records, the pharmacy records, the pill counts from the home, all of this is evidence that will be presented as the trial continues. But the fact that she had taken only a fraction of the medications prescribed to her is now in the trial's record, placed there by the prosecution through their questioning of her former husband. Patrick, for his part, testified he was not aware of how much medication she had or had not taken. He did not know. The woman taking only a fraction of 13 prescribed medications was doing so without his knowledge. Now let's address the specific legal standard the defense must meet, because understanding the precise threshold helps clarify why both sides believe they can win this case. Massachusetts uses the Model Penal Code standard for criminal responsibility. A defendant is not criminally responsible if, at the time of the conduct, as a result of mental disease or defect, she lacked substantial capacity either to appreciate the criminality of her conduct or to conform her conduct to the requirements of law. 2 prongs. Either one is sufficient for acquittal. The prosecution's argument on the first prong, appreciation of criminality, is the research. She looked up the driving time. She knew she needed a window. Knowing you need a window presupposes knowing that what you are about to do inside that window requires concealment from your husband. Concealment implies appreciation of wrongness. The defense's answer is that psychosis does not eliminate the capacity for organized behavior. A person in a psychotic state can plan, can execute sequences, can be organized in their actions while having no genuine appreciation of what those actions mean in the real world. If the voice in Lindsay's head told her that what she was doing was necessary, if her psychotic frame constructed a reality in which killing the children and herself was the required response to whatever the voice told her, then researching the driving time was not the act of someone who understood she was planning murder. It was the act of someone following instructions in a reality that did not exist. The prosecution's argument on the second prong, conforming conduct to the law, focuses on the phone call. She spoke normally to Patrick after the children were dead. She maintained the surface appearance of a normal conversation in the immediate aftermath of killing 3 children. That capacity, to present as normal while knowing what had just happened, suggests she retained the specific ability to conform her external behavior to social expectations. The defense's answer: even severely psychotic people can maintain surface-level social coherence. The psychosis disrupts what a person believes is happening, not necessarily their ability to perform familiar social interactions. Lindsay may have been in a completely different psychological reality during that call, a reality in which what she had just done was necessary, right, perhaps even merciful, while still being capable of speaking normally to her husband, because speaking normally to her husband was a behavior so practiced and automatic that the psychosis did not disrupt it. Neither argument is airtight. Both are coherent. The jury will have to choose between them based on the totality of everything they hear. Now let's address what Patrick's testimony means for both sides specifically, because he is, as Reddington said in his opening, a witness both sides want, and understanding why tells you something important about the specific dynamics of this trial. The prosecution wants the jury to hear about January 24th from Patrick's mouth, the specific day, the errand he was sent on, the phone call he took, what he found when he arrived. His account of that day is the factual record of what happened, delivered by the most credible possible witness. The prosecution is not trying to make Patrick a villainous figure. They are using him to establish the facts. The defense wants the jury to hear about the months before January 24th from Patrick's mouth, the deterioration, the hospitalizations, the medications, the intrusive thoughts Lindsay disclosed to him, and most powerfully, the sentence that Patrick said publicly in the New Yorker, and that Reddington will almost certainly draw out on cross-examination. I wasn't married to a monster. I was married to someone who got sick. If Patrick Clancy, the man who came home to find his children dying, who has since divorced Lindsay and remarried and built a new life, if that man tells the jury on the witness stand that she was not a monster, that she was someone who got sick, the specific weight of that judgment will be felt by every person in the courtroom. The prosecution can counter it. The prosecution will argue that the Patrick who said those words in 2024 was speaking from grief and love, not from forensic analysis of criminal responsibility. But they cannot unsay it. Cross-examination begins Wednesday. Reddington will have his turn with Patrick, and the specific details he draws out about the medications, about the hospitalizations, about what Lindsay told her husband in the months before January 24th, will be the foundation of the defense's case. Now let's also address something that has not received enough attention in the coverage of this trial: the fact that Patrick Clancy has since remarried. He has built a new life. He has moved to Manhattan. He is, by all available accounts, trying to live forward from January 24th, 2023. The specific psychological complexity of Patrick Clancy's position in this trial is almost without precedent in American legal history. He is the victim's widower, the man who lost 3 children, and he is the defendant's former husband. He has publicly defended the woman charged with killing his children. He sued the same medical providers she sued. He told the New Yorker she was not a monster. And he is now testifying as the prosecution's first witness in the trial that will determine whether she spends the rest of her life in prison or in a psychiatric hospital. He has remarried. He is building a new life. And every Wednesday he will return to a Plymouth courtroom and sit in the witness stand while his former wife watches from her wheelchair. The specific human reality of Patrick Clancy's life in 2026 is something no opening statement and no cross-examination will fully capture. She seemed happy, he said. She was having one of her best days. Cora was 5 years old. She was the oldest. She would have known the most, at 5, about what was happening. Dawson was 3. Callan was 8 months old. He held on in the hospital for 3 days after his mother strangled him with an exercise band. The prosecution says Lindsay Clancy acted to accomplish a very specific goal: to kill. The defense says 13 medications, a voice in her head, a woman who told her husband she was having thoughts of harming their children, who was hospitalized twice, who the medical system discharged twice, who on January 24th seemed happy and seemed to be having one of her best days. Both things are in the record. A snap of the fingers. One of her best days. 13 medications. She seemed fine on the phone. 18 jurors will spend months inside all of it. And at the end, they will tell us which one the law recognizes. Let's go even deeper into the Andrea Yates precedent, because it is the specific case that every attorney in that Plymouth courtroom is thinking about, and understanding it fully changes how you understand what Reddington is trying to build. Andrea Yates was a Houston woman who drowned her 5 children in a bathtub on June 20th, 2001. Russell, 6. John, 5. Paul, 3. Luke, 2. Mary, 6 months. She called her husband Rusty afterward and told him what she had done. She called 911. She told the dispatcher, "I just need to be arrested." She had been diagnosed with severe postpartum depression and postpartum psychosis after her 4th and 5th children were born. She had been hospitalized multiple times. She had attempted suicide twice. Her psychiatrist, Dr. Mohammed Saeed, had discontinued an antipsychotic medication approximately 10 days before the killings. He testified at trial that he had seen no signs of psychosis at her last appointment. Her first trial ended with a guilty verdict for capital murder. The prosecution's expert testified that Yates knew what she was doing was wrong. She had hidden in the bathroom when she heard her husband's car in the driveway after the killings. Knowing to hide, the prosecution argued, demonstrated that she understood her actions were wrong. The conviction was overturned in 2005 on a different ground. One of the prosecution's expert witnesses had given false testimony. A retrial was ordered. At the second trial in 2006, the jury found Andrea Yates not guilty by reason of insanity. She was committed to a maximum security state psychiatric facility in Texas, where she has remained. The specific differences and similarities between the Yates case and the Clancy case are the specific comparisons Reddington is building his case around. Both women had documented histories of postpartum psychiatric illness. Both had been hospitalized before the killings. Both had been under psychiatric care that, the defense argues in both cases, was inadequate to their actual condition. Both killed multiple children. Both survived. The specific difference that makes the Clancy case harder than the Yates case for the insanity defense is the research. Yates did not research a window of opportunity. She did not send her husband on a calculated errand along a calculated route. She acted on a morning when the opportunity presented itself. The prosecution in the Clancy case has a specific piece of evidence, the driving time research, that the prosecution in the Yates case did not have. And that piece of evidence is the specific argument that Lindsay Clancy, whatever her psychiatric condition, engaged in the kind of planning that is inconsistent with not appreciating the criminality of her conduct. Reddington's answer to this argument will eventually come from his psychiatric experts. They will testify that psychosis does not prevent planning, that a person can plan, can organize, can calculate, and still be in a completely different psychological reality than the actual world. That the driving time research was the specific behavior of a psychotic mind trying to accomplish what the voice told it to accomplish, not the behavior of a rational mind planning a crime it understood to be a crime. Whether that argument persuades 18 jurors in Plymouth County, Massachusetts in 2026 is the question this trial will eventually answer. Now let's talk about postpartum psychosis in full clinical detail. Because most people following this case have heard the term, but do not understand what it actually describes. And what it actually describes is more terrifying than most public discussions of it acknowledge. Postpartum psychosis is a psychiatric emergency. It is rare, affecting approximately 1 to 2 women per 1,000 who give birth. That rarity means that most obstetricians, pediatricians, and primary care providers encounter it rarely, if ever, in their careers. It is not the same as postpartum depression, which is far more common. It is not the same as the baby blues, which is nearly universal. It is a specific, acute psychiatric condition in which the normal architecture of reality, the shared framework of fact and consequence and time that the rest of us operate within, breaks down entirely. The specific symptoms of postpartum psychosis include delusions, fixed false beliefs immune to evidence, hallucinations, perceptions that have no external source, including the command hallucinations that Lindsay described in her civil lawsuit, disorganized thinking, rapid shifts in mood. In severe cases, a complete detachment from the normal emotional and cognitive framework that allows a person to understand the meaning of their own actions. The specific neuroscience behind postpartum psychosis is not fully understood. The leading theory involves the dramatic hormonal changes that follow childbirth, specifically the rapid drop in estrogen and progesterone levels after delivery, and the specific effect of those changes on dopamine and serotonin neurotransmitter systems. In women with specific neurological vulnerabilities, those hormonal changes can trigger a cascade that produces acute psychosis. The cascade can develop rapidly. It can reach its peak within days or weeks of delivery. It can produce behavior that bears no relationship to the person's normal personality or values. Lindsay Clancy was a labor and delivery nurse. She had held newborns in her professional capacity. She had supported mothers through the specific hormonal chaos of the immediate postpartum period. If anyone should have recognized the signs of postpartum psychosis in herself, it is arguable that Lindsay should have. And yet, according to the defense, the illness progressed despite her professional knowledge, because postpartum psychosis does not exempt people with medical training from its effects. The specific clinical feature that makes postpartum psychosis particularly difficult to treat is its rapid onset and escalation. A woman who is psychologically normal on Monday can be in the grip of acute psychosis by the following weekend. The window between first symptoms and a psychiatric emergency can be extraordinarily narrow. The hospitalization system, designed to assess, stabilize, and discharge, is not always equipped for the pace at which postpartum psychosis moves. Lindsay was hospitalized in late December 2022. She was admitted because she was still having thoughts of suicide. She was discharged. She was hospitalized again in early January 2023, discharged again. 3 weeks later, she sent Patrick to CVS. The defense will argue that the specific pace of her deterioration and the specific inadequacy of the treatment she received is exactly what the clinical literature on postpartum psychosis predicts in cases where the condition is not aggressively and effectively treated. That she was in a system that was trying to help her, but that lacked the specific clinical tools to adequately intervene. That the 13 medications were not the sign of a system that had successfully managed her condition. They were the sign of a system that was trying everything and failing. The prosecution will argue that a woman who was sufficiently clear-headed to research a driving time was not in the grip of acute psychosis. That the specific behavior of January 24th, the calculated timing, the phone call, the specific sequence of acts, is inconsistent with the clinical picture the defense is trying to paint. That Lindsay's ability to present as happy and having one of her best days on the day of the killings is not the behavior of someone whose connection to reality had broken down. Both arguments are coherent. Both are supported by medical literature. The specific battle of the expert witnesses, the forensic psychiatrists who will testify for each side, will be the heart of this trial. Now let's also address what the civil lawsuits that Lindsay and Patrick filed against the healthcare providers mean for the trial, because both of them sued the same providers. The man who is testifying as the prosecution's first witness filed a civil lawsuit making the same argument as his former wife's criminal defense. The medical system failed Lindsay Clancy. That parallel is not legally irrelevant. The civil lawsuit's existence does not change the criminal standard Lindsay must meet, but it shapes the credibility landscape of the trial. When Reddington argues that the medical system failed Lindsay, he is making an argument that Patrick Clancy has made in a separate legal proceeding. The prosecution cannot argue that the over-medication claim is Lindsay's self-interested invention when the father of the children she killed has filed a lawsuit making the same claim. The specific contents of the civil lawsuit are part of the available record. Lindsay said a voice in her head ordered her to kill the children and herself. She said 13 medications were prescribed. She said the providers failed to properly diagnose, treat, and monitor her. Patrick's lawsuit makes parallel claims. Both lawsuits are pending. The jury in the criminal trial is not deciding the civil case. But the existence of Patrick's civil lawsuit, his independent legal endorsement of the argument that the medical system failed his wife, is context that no amount of prosecution testimony can fully erase. Now let's think about what the coming weeks of testimony will look like. Patrick returns Wednesday. He is expected to describe his return to the house on January 24th. What he saw when he walked in. What he did. His testimony will be the most difficult evidence the jury hears in the early weeks of this trial, not because of its legal significance, but because of what it represents humanly. A father describing the night he came home to find his children. After Patrick, the prosecution will call first responders and investigators, the physical evidence, the exercise bands, the basement, the second-story window, the specific forensic record of what happened in the Clancy home on January 24th. Then the medical experts. The prosecution's psychiatric witnesses will testify to their assessment of Lindsay's mental state on January 24th. That she appreciated the criminality of her conduct, that she could have conformed her behavior to the law, that the specific evidence of planning and execution is inconsistent with the legal standard for insanity. The defense's medical experts will follow. They will present the opposite clinical reading of the same evidence, the same medical records, the same medication history, the same behavior, a different conclusion. 18 jurors will decide whose experts they believe. This trial will last months. The verdict, when it comes, will not be simple. It will be the outcome of weeks of testimony about the most difficult question medicine and law together can ask. When does illness become the explanation for what a person does, rather than simply the context in which they chose to do it? She seemed happy. She was having one of her best days. Cora was 5. She was old enough to understand more than her siblings. Dawson was 3. Callan was 8 months old, and he fought for 3 days in the hospital. Patrick Clancy has since divorced Lindsay. He has remarried. He moved to Manhattan. He is building a life forward from a night he cannot leave behind. He will return to the witness stand on Wednesday. He will describe what he came home to, and Lindsay Clancy, in her wheelchair at the defense table, will watch him do it. Let's also examine the specific significance of the judge's ruling that the 911 call Patrick made will not be made public. Because that ruling, granted at Patrick's specific request, is itself a piece of information about what is in that call. Patrick filed the motion asking the judge to suppress public access to the 911 recording and to the photographs of his deceased children. Judge Sullivan granted it on Friday before the trial began. The jury will hear the call. Court TV's cameras will not capture the audio. The public will not hear what Patrick said to the dispatcher in the minutes after he found Cora, Dawson, and Callan. Why would Patrick, who has been so public about so many aspects of this case, who gave a lengthy interview to The New Yorker, who has advocated publicly for his former wife, specifically ask the judge to prevent the public from hearing his 911 call? The most likely answer is grief. That call contains his voice in the worst moment of his life. It contains whatever he said to the dispatcher when he found his children. Whatever sound comes out of a father's mouth when he walks into his basement and finds what Patrick found. He has been willing to discuss that night in abstract terms, to describe what happened, to testify about it in court. He is not willing to let the world hear the specific sound of his voice in that moment. The judge agreed. The call will be evidence in the criminal trial. It will not be evidence the public ever hears directly. The photographs of the deceased children are similarly protected from public release. The jury will see them. The court record will contain them. The public will not. Those two rulings together, no public audio of the 911 call, no public photographs of the children, shape the specific way this case will be experienced outside the courtroom. The jury will have the full evidentiary record. The public will have the testimony described, the opening statements summarized, the witnesses quoted. But the specific sounds and images that most directly capture what happened on January 24th will remain inside the courtroom. That is arguably appropriate. Cora, Dawson, and Callan were 5, 3, and 8 months old. Their deaths are not a spectacle for public consumption. Their father's grief, in its most raw expression, is not a soundtrack for true crime coverage. Judge Sullivan's rulings protect the dignity of the children and the integrity of Patrick's most private moment in ways that the adversarial legal system does not always produce. Now let's also go to the specific significance of Lindsay and Patrick having divorced since the killings, because that fact, she is now his ex-wife, he has remarried, is part of the context in which every piece of his testimony will be heard. They were married on January 24, 2023. They are no longer married in July 2026. Something happened between those 2 points, not just the killings, but the legal, emotional, and relational reckoning with the killings that ended the marriage. Patrick has said publicly that he believes Lindsay was sick, not monstrous. He has filed a civil lawsuit alongside her. He has spoken publicly in her defense. And he has also divorced her, remarried, and moved to a different city. Those facts are not contradictory. A person can believe that someone they loved was destroyed by illness and still be unable to remain in the marriage that was also destroyed by that illness. A person can advocate for a former spouse's legal treatment as a patient rather than a criminal while also accepting that the relationship cannot continue. Patrick Clancy is doing all of these things simultaneously, and the specific psychological complexity of that position is something no cross-examination can fully illuminate. But the divorce matters in one specific legal context: credibility. A witness who remains married to the defendant and who has filed civil lawsuits alongside her might be perceived by some jurors as a witness whose testimony is shaped by continued loyalty. A witness who has divorced the defendant and remarried is, arguably, a more independent voice. His advocacy for her, his refusal to call her a monster, comes from a man who has already disentangled himself from the marriage. That may make it more powerful, not less. Reddington knows this. The prosecution knows this. How each side uses the divorce, or avoids it, in their examination and cross-examination of Patrick will be one of the tactical questions of the early weeks. Now let's address the medication question from a slightly different angle. The question of what it means that she was taking only a fraction of what was prescribed. Because this detail, surfaced by the prosecution, actually cuts in a complicated direction that does not cleanly benefit either side. The prosecution's implication is that Lindsay was not as sick as the prescription record suggests because she was not actually taking the medications. That the 13 medication narrative Reddington presented in his opening is inflated, that the actual pharmacological landscape of Lindsay's brain was different from what the prescription history implies because she was not consuming the medications. But consider the defense's possible answer to that implication. If the medications that were prescribed to Lindsay were so poorly tolerated, so ineffective, or so actively harmful to her condition that she could only take a fraction of them, if the medications were making her worse rather than better, and she knew it, and she stopped taking them or took less of them, that is not evidence of manipulation. That is evidence of exactly the medical failure Reddington is arguing. A person who has been prescribed 13 medications and can only tolerate a fraction of them is not a person whose medical treatment was working. They are a person whose medical providers kept prescribing medications that were not being tolerated without apparently understanding why, or without apparently being fully aware of how little their patient was actually consuming. The specific question of why Lindsay was taking only a fraction of the medications will be central to the medical expert testimony on both sides. Did she stop taking them because they made things worse? Because she was managing her presentation? Because the side effects were intolerable? The answer to that question is not in the public record yet. It will be. Now let's step back and consider what this trial means beyond the courtroom. Because the Lindsay Clancy case has become, over 3.5 years, one of the most significant public conversations about postpartum mental health in American history. Hundreds of thousands of women responded to this case by sharing their own experiences of postpartum psychiatric illness, of intrusive thoughts, of depression that went untreated, of anxiety that was minimized, of hospitalizations that discharged them too soon, of medications that were prescribed without adequate monitoring. The specific resonance of this case with that population is not incidental. It reflects a genuine gap in how American medicine treats perinatal mental health. The specific system that failed Lindsay Clancy, if the defense's argument is correct, is not a unique system that only existed in Massachusetts. It is the general system of perinatal mental health care in the United States, with its specific reliance on medications that are poorly understood in the postpartum context, its specific reluctance to hospitalize for extended periods, its specific inadequacy at monitoring patients in the dangerous weeks between episodes. Whatever the jury decides about Lindsay Clancy's criminal responsibility, this trial is producing the most detailed public examination of that system that has ever occurred in an American courtroom. The medical experts, the medication records, the hospitalization history, all of it will be in the public record at the end of this trial, and whatever the verdict, that record will be used by researchers, advocates, and policymakers for years. Cora Clancy was 5 years old. She is gone. Dawson was 3. Callan was 8 months. They are gone. Their deaths are the reason we are in this courtroom. And their deaths are the reason that this trial, whatever its outcome, will matter beyond the verdict. Patrick Clancy took a deep breath on the witness stand and described each of them. He seemed to get emotional. He took deep breaths. She seemed happy, he said. She was having one of her best days. He will return Wednesday to describe what he found when he came home. Let's go to what the verdict options actually are and what each one means practically for Lindsay Clancy and for everyone connected to this case. Because the public discussion of the insanity defense often gets this wrong, treating a not guilty by reason of insanity verdict as equivalent to freedom, or treating a guilty verdict as the only form of accountability. If the jury finds Lindsay Clancy guilty of first-degree murder on all 3 counts, she is sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole under Massachusetts law. She is 35 years old. A guilty verdict means she spends the rest of her life in a correctional facility. She is already paralyzed from the waist down. A life sentence in that condition, in a Massachusetts prison, is its own specific reality. A reality the justice system imposes without particular accommodation for her disability beyond the minimum required by law. If the jury finds Lindsay Clancy not guilty by reason of insanity on all 3 counts, the court initiates commitment proceedings. Under Massachusetts law, a person found not guilty by reason of insanity is committed to a state psychiatric facility. The duration of that commitment is determined by the court based on findings about whether Lindsay continues to pose a danger to herself or others. In cases involving the killing of children, courts tend to be extremely conservative about release. The commitment in the Yates case has now lasted 20 years and is ongoing. Lindsay is already at Tewksbury Hospital, a state facility. An NGRI verdict formalizes that placement and subjects her continued confinement to specific legal standards. But in practical terms, her day-to-day life may change very little. The third option, guilty but mentally ill, is not a verdict option in Massachusetts. That verdict exists in some states as a middle path, but Massachusetts does not recognize it. The jury's options are guilty, not guilty by reason of insanity, or simple not guilty. The last option, acquittal without any finding of mental illness, is not a realistic outcome in this case because the killings are not disputed. So the practical difference between the two real outcomes is this. Guilty means a state prison. Not guilty by reason of insanity means a state psychiatric hospital. Lindsay is already in a state facility. What changes is the nature of the confinement and the legal framework governing her continued presence there. For the Clancy children, neither outcome changes anything. For the families who have followed this case, the meaning of each verdict is deeply personal and not reducible to a legal analysis. For the national conversation about postpartum mental health that this trial has generated, the verdict will matter enormously, either as an affirmation that mental illness can constitute legal exculpation for acts of violence, or as a statement that the legal system does not recognize the specific severity of postpartum psychosis as sufficient to relieve criminal responsibility. That national conversation is one of the reasons this trial matters beyond Plymouth County. Whatever the verdict, it will shape how prosecutors charge and defend postpartum mental illness cases for years. It will shape how juries understand the defense. It will shape how medical providers think about their legal and ethical obligations to pregnant and postpartum patients. And it will shape how women who experience postpartum psychiatric symptoms, and their families, understand what is happening to them and what they can expect from the systems that are supposed to help. That is the specific weight this trial carries beyond the verdict it will eventually produce. One final thought about Patrick Clancy and the specific position he occupies in the national imagination around this case. He has become, for many people following it, the most compelling figure in the trial, not because of his legal role, but because of what his choices represent. He lost 3 children. He was the one who came home. He has publicly refused to call the mother of those children a monster. He filed a civil lawsuit with her against the medical providers. He has testified for the prosecution in a trial that will determine whether she spends her life in prison. He has divorced her and remarried and moved to Manhattan. All of those things are simultaneously true. They do not resolve into a simple narrative about forgiveness or justice or grief or love. They are the specific, complicated, irreducibly human choices of a man who has been living inside the most unimaginable situation for 3.5 years and who has chosen, at every turn, to refuse the simpler narrative. He could have called her a monster. Many people in his position would have. He chose instead to say, she was not a monster. She was someone who got sick. He will return to the stand on Wednesday and describe what he found when he came home on January 24, 2023. He will do it in the same courtroom where Lindsay Clancy sits in her wheelchair. He will do it with the same voice that said she was having one of her best days. Whatever this trial decides, Patrick Clancy has already given his answer. She seemed happy. She was having one of her best days. And then she killed their children. And Patrick Clancy, 3.5 years later, still does not call her a monster. If you have been affected by postpartum mental health issues, or if you are experiencing thoughts of harm to yourself or others, contact the Postpartum Support International Helpline at 1-800-944-4773, available in English and Spanish. Crisis support is available through the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline by calling or texting 988. Hit the like button. Subscribe to Forensic Disconnect. Drop a comment. Does Patrick's testimony help the prosecution or the defense? Do you think the insanity defense should succeed? And do you think the medical providers should face consequences? We read every single comment. She seemed happy. We will be back tomorrow.